Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hi, everybody. This is Dr. Cynthia Toolin-Wilson with my show, Author to Author. Today, I'm interviewing Matt D'Antuono and his third book, Philosophy Fridays, Armchair Philosophy Sessions from a High School Physics Teacher. Hi, Matt. How are you?
Good. How are you? Thanks for having me on.
I'm glad to have you on again. Your writing is excellent, and I always enjoy the interviews.
Okay.
So I think this is the third one we've done.
This is the third one. That's right.
Yes,
with,
that's great.
A Fool's Errand, which was the first one that En Route published, and strangely enough, was probably the last one to kind of come about in any of its form. And then we talked about The Wise Guy and the Fool, which I've been working on for a long time, like the collection of stories and that sort of thing. And then this one was the third one published by En Route, which was relatively easy to write because it's just what I do with my students each week.
Great.
Yeah.
Okay. Would you like to start us with a prayer, and then we'll start going through the book?
I'd be happy to. Okay. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Heavenly Father, we love you, and we acknowledge that all wisdom, all knowledge of truth, all insight comes from you, God, who are the source of truth. And we ask that you inspire us as we have this conversation in the ways that I have tried to introduce truth to my students, to think deeply about the big questions that ultimately lead us all to you. Amen. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Amen.
Okay, so this is a more lengthy book, I think, than the other two. You have 37 chapters and an appendix, and that's actually intimidating to me. I write also, but I don't have anything with that many chapters.
Yeah. This would be abnormal for me as well. Except for the fact that just each chapter represents a week of the school year.
I see.
And so this is kind of what's happening each Friday, for the most part. A couple of exceptions, but
okay.
Yeah, and that's why some are quite short too. It's long, but some are short because I'm just dealing with the time at the beginning of class.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, as we discussed previously, you are a physics teacher, but you have a degree in philosophy also. And
that's right.
So you're teaching a high school, and every Friday you give a little lesson on philosophy, which I think is fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, it's fun. It's fun for me to do that.
And who would think of it? But that's such a practical use of your degree, to get the high schoolers to start thinking philosophically. Is if it was a philosophy class, an official one, they'd probably be like, "Oh no." But I can see where this one would be fun.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of an edge that I have in doing it this way. It's physics class, but we do this exercise, and the students love it. They come in and they're like, "Oh, it's Friday. Yeah, we're going to do Philosophy Friday." Yeah, that whole thing. And so, and really, it's really started with students too. Years ago, when I was first starting off teaching in the public school, and so that's another thing too, is that this is a public school system. So there's no kind of theology instruction. There's no philosophy or anything like a traditional liberal arts style education in the traditional sense. And so I keep things secular, but of course in the back of my mind I'm thinking theologically as well. But years ago I was just talking with my students, and I forget what exactly it was, but something came up about the nature of science or whatever it was, and I And I talked to my students. I said, this is actually what we're talking about now is philosophy. And they're like, philosophy? What's that? And so I was trying to describe to them and telling them that I was actually, at that time, I think I was still working on my bachelor's degree in philosophy, or I had just finished it. And they're like, really? Like, what's that about? And then they want to know, can you teach us some philosophy? And I thought to myself, well, how could I do that? I don't know. How could I work that in? Would that be okay? And I was also something that we are taught as high school teachers, we are taught is good practice, is that there should be a question, something for students to do when they first walk into the classroom. And my supervisor had opened me up to the possibility of asking some things that weren't always 100% content related. At the time, I was teaching at an urban school in New Jersey, and questions like, do you eat breakfast? Is it important to eat breakfast? And so I was like, well, that door's been open, so maybe I'll use some of these class starting times, just 5 minutes at the beginning of class, to kind of do some philosophy with them. And they really enjoyed it. And then I would do it a bunch of times, and then I'd forget, or we'd have other content to get to, so I wouldn't have time for it. And the students would ask for it again, so I would start it again, and it was this stop-start style. And then finally what I decided to do was just do philosophy every Friday. And I don't know if that was my idea or if it was a student's idea, and it just turned into Philosophy Fridays. And so now when I start a class, every new year at the beginning of the year, I introduce it to them. I say, look, this has turned into something of a tradition. I hope it's okay with you. And I haven't heard any objections yet.
Right.
And the school where I teach now, we have a rotating block schedule. Sometimes the class doesn't meet on Friday. We meet 3 days in a row and then a day off, 3 days in a row and a day off. And if Philosophy Friday has to be moved to another day, then it's something like Thinking Thursday or Wisdom Wednesday. They play we play with the name, yeah. Something just to keep it fun and alliterative at the same time.
Very nice.
So, yeah.
Wow.
And so that's what I talk about in the introduction, which is the introduction and also chapter 1. And so this, I've been doing this for, I don't know, maybe 10 years or so, probably more than that, actually. And so I have kind of a collection of questions that I use for my students. And then I had the idea a couple of years ago that I could just record. Actually, it was a few years ago because it took a year to do the recording. And so for a year, and I do this in more than one class. So it's not, or in all my classes, it's not just one level of students. I teach AP Physics, calculus-based AP Physics. So these kids in this class are like the cream of the crop. Some of these students are in multivariable calculus. They already got a 5 on the AP Calculus test the year before as juniors. So, yeah, and then I also teach some basically special ed level classes. So it's the full range of students. And I hit the record button for my Philosophy Fridays for a year. And then I kept all the recordings and went through and kind of did I tried to do like a mosaic. So each chapter doesn't represent one single exact conversation in exactly the way that it went, but it's reflective of a couple of different conversations. But I really was just typing out what I said, what the students said. If there was something that sounded different or sounded strange, I would change it just a little bit for the sake of writing, because speaking in conversation and writing a book are a little bit different.
Sure.
But I really tried to stay as true to the conversations as I could. And so that's why there are 37 chapters. So there's the introduction, and then chapter 2 is the first day of school. And then after that, I go into the regular, Friday schedule.
And so you start with, have you ever seen the number 2?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
I love that one.
Yeah. I don't remember when it was in my study of philosophy that I realized that numbers are not physical objects, that they're really quite strange if you think about them. Like, what is the existence of a number? And that that what we use, what we would point to, is really just a symbol. And so it's great. It's a great introduction because it's something that it really hits students in the face, and yet at the same time they can realize it. Like, they realize right away what I'm trying to say. They realize that thing is really just a symbol. And I wish that as I was recording, I could also get the expressions on students' faces as I'm doing this, because it's just great. Like, what in the world is this guy talking about? And so I asked him, have you ever seen the number 2? And they're like, of course, And then I don't know why it took me so long, but it wasn't until a number of years later that one student was like, "Oh yeah, I was in the toilet this morning." I was like, "Okay, not what I'm talking about." But the number itself, they point to it. It's on the clock. I write it on the board, and I point to it and I say, "So this is the number 2?" And they say, "Yeah." And then I say, "Well, I have news for you." And I try to make this really dramatic pause to kind of draw it out. And I say, "This is not the number 2." And I get just this pause, and you can sense the attitude of the students is like, "What? This guy is like destroying my universe right now. What is happening?" And I say, this is just a symbol that represents the number 2. It's like, oh, and then they get it. And really, and then to talk about the nature of numbers, and that really, as far as philosophy is concerned, that's an introduction to the whole way that we as human beings know. Like, what does it mean about us as human beings that we can operate with and talk about, and even come up with things that don't have any physical existence, that are purely abstract, things like numbers. And I don't get into it. I don't have the time, and but I try to just kind of poke around a little bit to get them to think about that. And I remember one time, it's even in here, so someone must have said it at this point. They said, everything I've learned is a lie, they say. Like, it's all, their whole world is becoming unraveled. You start to ask some of these questions, which is not a terribly uncommon reaction to philosophy when you encounter someone like Plato and Aristotle for the first time. It's like, what in the world? I thought I knew something, and now I don't. What's happening here? But that's another part of what I'm trying to do, is to get them to realize that they don't necessarily know the things that they think they know.
Right.
The sort of everyday understanding of things is really insufficient if we want to deeply understand truth and ourselves and the world around us.
Right. Yeah.
And so, but even, one of the philosophical questions too that I start with, on the first day of school, kind of backing up, is even why go to school in the first place? Because we live in such a utilitarian world. And I see this because I ask a lot of questions and they constantly come back to it. But it's this idea that the end justifies the means, and the whole goal of school is so that they can get a good grade, get into a good college, and then get a good job, and then that's it. I mean, can be very, very, very college focused. It's just about college, and there's a loss of this sense of education is really about developing who we are.
Right.
And I asked specifically too, why physics? Like, why would you study physics? Who cares about physics? And I tell them straight out that most of what they learn in this class they're never going to use again. So what's the point? And then I introduce it here in the very beginning of class, and I refer to it a couple times throughout the year. And then the final lecture, which is in the book, is about this idea of beauty. That the reason we learn, and maybe the best reason to learn physics, is to see the beauty in it. Even the very little bit that you can see in a high school introductory algebra-based class. Beauty.
Right.
And actually, I was just reading. I just finished a paper on beauty, and I'm planning on writing another paper about beauty for my classes at Holy Apostles. And I ran across a recent translation of Plato in the Republic when he's talking about education and music. And this translator, I think Desmond Lee, trying to make sure I don't know if that's the name, it's close to it, something like that, translates this one line that the purpose of education is to learn to see beauty. And then I looked at it because I have the Loeb Classical Library, and I don't know a lot of Greek, but I looked back, and the word education there is musica, because talking about music. But somehow the translator thought it was still appropriate to translate that as education. The whole point of education is to teach us to see beauty. And, I mean, from my perspective, seeing the transcendentals, the one, the true, the good, the beautiful, beauty is the radiance of unity. Beauty is the radiance of truth. It's the radiance of goodness. And so really the education to see beauty is an education in all of that, and becoming one ourselves, becoming true human beings and good human beings. And then we can see beauty more fully that way. Of course, I don't get into any of this with the students. I just tell them, I said, this isn't going to make any sense right now, but I'm saying it to plant the seed. Hopefully it'll make sense later on. Beauty is one of the things that we're after here. That's one of the main goals of education, not just getting into a good college, not so you can make a lot of money. It's about the development of who you are as a person.
Right. It's such a utilitarian approach.
Yeah.
Let me learn as much as I can so I can get in the best school, so I can get a good job and make a lot of money. Oh, boy.
Yeah. And it creates a lot of anxiety, too. And they get it from the culture. I mean, the parents, there's a lot of pressure. And it's not even questioned.
Yeah.
Most students
like
don't.
That a long time.
Yeah.
It's been like that a long
I think you're
time.
right.
I remember that when I'm 70 now. I remember when I was 17 years old in one of the auditoriums. We were listening to someone, principal probably, and I was panic-stricken because I realized that within a year I had to be in college, and I wasn't sure my grades were good enough. So it's been like that for a long time.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yep. And certainly we're not thinking about it. I mean, the everyday person is not thinking, oh, this is a utilitarian approach. So even to be able to identify something, to name it as this type of approach, and even to recognize that there are other approaches, that there are other possible reasons. We don't just take for granted. One of the quotes that I have on my wall, and I try to point out to the students at some point during the year, is the idea that the unexamined idea is not worth thinking. And that's from Mortimer Adler. And he took the quote from Socrates, that the unexamined life is not worth living.
Right.
And he just changed it a little bit. Each idea, we don't even realize that we're thinking ideas, let alone that we haven't thought about the ideas that we don't even realize that we're thinking. And so, but each idea, we need to think about it to make sure that we're holding it. And again, that's a big part of what I'm trying to do. And so like in chapter 4, so this is, they're still getting used to me as a teacher. I'm getting used to them as students. So I keep it relatively straightforward. And I ask them, how do you know the earth goes around the sun? Something that would seem like a very simple question. And then they give me all kinds of reasons that they think that the earth goes around the sun. But as I push them and I push them and I push them, they always do. Eventually they come to the conclusion that the only reason they think the earth goes around the sun is that that's what they've been taught. Right. That's what their teachers have told them. And I'm not telling them, listen, you're wrong, because I too believe that the earth goes around the sun. But I want to push them so that they can start to question the things that they think they know.
Yeah.
Do they really know those things? Or is it a matter of blind trust?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and I use this as a, one, first of all, it's a little bit of a pet peeve to me that people tend to look at, pre-scientific Europe as the Dark Ages and everyone's steeped in ignorance and error.
Yeah.
I want them to realize that, no, there was a lot of great stuff going on and a very deep intellectual tradition that was taking place. Because we tend to get the impression, and really it's rhetoric, but we tend to get the impression that, people before the time of Galileo were all just a bunch of idiots. And, because they didn't think that the Earth went around the sun. But the simple fact is that was the best science. They didn't believe it because they were ignorant. They believed it because that's what the best science at the time suggested.
Right.
Trying to get them to have a little bit more of a broad historical view, which I think is part of the history of science. And then talking about philosophy as having to unlearn things that we think we know. Oftentimes our ideas have to be undone. And then there's this confusion. Like the students who, when they realize the number 2 is not the symbol, and they're like, my whole world has been a lie. It can feel like that sometimes. It's frustrating.
Sure.
It's important. I use that. And then the difference between knowledge and opinion. And this is another really big pet peeve of mine. And I've written about this here in the book and in my other books, and wrote an essay about it. It was on the internet. Because I remember learning as a student to distinguish between fact and opinion statements. And we'd get these worksheets, and they would have statements like, water freezes at 0 degrees Celsius. Oh, that's a fact. And then another statement like chocolate is the best flavor of ice cream. Oh, that's an opinion. Mm-hmm. And this training in the fact versus opinion dichotomy. But when I started learning philosophy, I realized that that's actually not right. Every statement in the end is either true or false. What it's really saying is, fact, things are being labeled as fact or opinion, like facts, things that are true or false. And then other statements, what's labeled as an opinion, it's like it's subjective. It's neither true nor false. But really, if we carefully define what the statement means, chocolate is the best flavor of ice cream, what we really mean by that, then that's either true or false. It might mean something like chocolate is my favorite flavor of ice cream. And that's either true or false. Either I'm lying about my chocolate ice cream preferences, or I'm telling the truth. And this one's really tough because students it's been ingrained in students. But I, reading even just Plato, he discusses it in the Republic, that knowledge is, what we know, and we know that we know it. And opinion is a form of knowledge that really shouldn't even be called knowledge. It's an idea that we have, and we don't know why we know it. We can't justify it. It's a weaker form of knowledge, you could say.
Okay.
And so I take the opportunity, and it doesn't always come up here. Actually, I think it might have been a couple of weeks before we were all sent home for the COVID-19 crisis. I was asking my students, because someone brought something up, and it's a pet peeve because it often comes up in questions when we're discussing something about ethics. My students will say, well, isn't that just a matter of opinion? In other words, isn't that really neither true nor false? It's just whatever people want it to be because it's a matter of opinion. And that's where it comes up. But even just a few weeks ago, it came up, and I said to the students, well, have we talked about fact and opinion? Because I don't have like a specific place where it comes up. It comes up somewhere. And they said, no, we haven't talked about it. So we got to discuss it at that time. But I guess this year it came up, at least in one class, right away. So trying to get them to think critically. And chapter 5, and I'm trying to address also things that are very, very common. Very, very common ways of thinking that are wrong, and then breaking them down. So in number 5, I put up on the board, so when they come in, this is already there. It says, what is logically wrong with the following statement? Science is the only way to know what is true. Now, this works really well because it is a physics class.
Sure.
So they're expecting us to be able to discuss science, and this is really philosophy of science. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes students will start by trying to say something like, well, I know things through means other than science. And I say, yeah, okay, I understand the true, but what's wrong with the statement itself? And I try to point out that really, ultimately, the statement is self-refuting. If we take a look at it, the science is the only way to know what is true. That statement itself is not one that science can test. Mm-hmm. And I draw a little diagram on the board, and it's in here. So one time I did this, and I took a picture of the board. Mm-hmm. And so my book also has photographs.
Yeah.
On page 17, it's there. And so I talk about, okay, well, how does science work? How do these other things, like math, history, philosophy, how do these things work? There are these different kind of domains of knowledge, which is, you have to be careful doing because we don't want to separate knowledge that happens so much as it is already. But I'm trying to get across the idea that there are these various ways of thinking. And I say, okay, well, this statement itself, that science is the only way to know what is true, I say, where does this go? And so we put it into the philosophy circle. But then the statement itself is crossing out all the other circles and only leaving science. So it crosses itself out. Mm-hmm. But this is one of those really insidious ideas because it comes up again and again, even after having gone through this with the students. And a lot of them kind of reacting positively or kind of seeing the light turn on. Later on in the year, we'll have similar conversations, and they will say something like, well, it's not scientific, or, science is really the only way we can know anything, all the rest of this stuff. They're talking about ethics, like, well, it's really just a matter of opinion. It's not science. It's so subtle, and it plays on, and it's just mixed into everything that we do and the way that we think as a society, unfortunately.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So hopefully some of the students come away having understood that. Again, this idea of trying to make sure that there are no statements or no ideas that we believe that are unexamined. Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Another
so
really...
you're exposing them. You're exposing them to some pretty interesting ideas here, or So even if they kind of backslide, I know that's an odd expression to use, but even if they backslide away from something, then when you remind them of it, they're going to see the mistake.
Right.
And I bet by the end of the year, they're much better thinkers than they were in September.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's my hope. That's my sincere hope. And of course, being a lifelong learner myself and having been a teacher, I realize that the learning process is not linear, you could say. It's these like jagged edges. You learn something and you kind of forget it, but then you learn it again and you learn it better the second time. Yes. And you don't use it for a while. So it's a whole really lifelong process that we're all on.
Yes.
To some degree.
Mm-hmm.
And so another super, super common idea in society today is this idea that there is no truth. That that truth is relative, it's subjective. Everything is really just a matter of opinion, except, of course, for science. Mm-hmm. And but I want students to see to the power of logic and the power of thinking critically. That all we're doing is talking, and they're realizing that certain ideas are wrong. So again, I read on the board what's logically wrong with the following statement. Say there is no truth. And then oftentimes students will get this right away. They'll realize, well, if there's no truth, then that statement's not true, which is great. Mm-hmm. But sometimes it takes some questioning of things. And then students will Oh, and in this case, I guess this time someone asked, what is truth? Which I was really happy they asked about. And then here I refer to the common definition of truth. It comes from Aristotle. And I refer to my wall. And so on my wall, and that's what the appendix is. I put the appendix here because if you were to walk into my classroom, even still today, unless anyone's taken it down in the last 4 weeks, I have over 150 quotes on the wall. I just print them out on white paper, black ink, and it takes me a long time, but it's worth it to put them all up there. And they're all quotes about philosophy, about science, about mathematics, about learning, education, all these different things that I've run across in my own reading, and I think are worth sharing with my physics students in a secular setting. And one of those quotes on the wall is Aristotle's definition of truth. And so, and then we discuss how this statement that really expresses a very common idea that there is no truth is actually self-refuting, because if there's no truth, then that statement can't be true. And so the idea is just nonsense. And yet, many people hold it in their heads, and they think that it's true, but it's nonsense. So I tried, again, pointing out, we need to think about our ideas and the things that they mean. And then some things are just for fun, and it is a little different every year. This year I actually asked my students if they do animals think? Can animals think? And that was an interesting little conversation that, if I had asked it during this year, it would have gone into the book and would have been interesting. But it always changes, and sometimes it depends on the students also. What I think there's an idea I think they should explore, I'll put it in there. But I try to have fun with this one, sort of like Introduction to Ethics, number 7. And I asked them if they could have any superpower, what would it be and why? I just let them talk for a while about what they would do. And it is always kind of interesting to see how many of them would pick a superpower so they could do bad things. So they could rob people, so they could cheat, get through locked doors, be a spy. I'm like, okay. But again, what I do is I try to point out that they're coming up with these ideas, things that they want to do, because they think that whatever they do, whatever those things are the things that are going to make them really happy. Those are things that they can't do, but they would do if they could, because they think that it's going to make them happy. We only do things, or we want to do things, because there's a perceived good. And ethics, ethics, but really metaphysics, it's all mixed, is where we explore the question of what is the good, and what is true happiness. And I mean, I know I was surprised to find out, and I think my students are surprised to find out, that happiness is actually one of the fundamental questions when we're talking about ethics. Ethics always seems to be about just duty and right and wrong. But really what we're asking about is, what is the true good? And the true good, of course, is related to happiness. We do what we think is good because we think that that's what will make us happy. And then, some of the, like in number 8, some of these weeks are dictated by things happening in school. So 8 is Respect Week, where we talk about bullying and things along those. It's a New Jersey statewide thing. So I use it to talk about what is respect. And again, students are oftentimes surprised, and I can tell, unnerved, that they don't necessarily really know what respect means. I kind of wonder if administrators found out, because I'm actually kind of being subversive, because it's respect, and respect, we should respect each other, and I agree, but I want people to think critically about it. So oftentimes it's it's the slogans and the propaganda that I undermine in these explorations, because I ask them, well, what is respect, and should we respect everybody, yes or no? And oftentimes students come out and they're pretty clear, no, you shouldn't respect everybody. They have to earn your respect. Well, then what exactly is respect? And they can't come up with an answer. They don't really know, And so we operate on these slogans and headlines without even really critically thinking about what we're doing. And then in 9, we read the story of the Ring of Gyges from the Republic. And so this is always really fun because, one, it's an interesting story to begin with. It's from a classic work of philosophy, and so I take the time to kind of introduce the Republic, tell them what it's about, and then it's also good because it relates directly to the conversation we had a couple of weeks ago about superpowers, because Gyges gets the ring and he can turn invisible. And then, of course, it's also cool because this is where Tolkien got the idea for the ring, because he puts the ring on his finger and he becomes invisible, or in this case he turns it. But in this, and I don't think Tolkien would have had any problem saying, no, of course that's where I got the idea. He was very well familiar with this story, I'm sure. And so it all kind of comes together for the students, and I think they get that satisfaction of kind of seeing things, seeing the connections between things. But again, to explore this idea of what is it that makes us really, truly happy. Yeah. And I try to get across the idea that this idea of what is it that makes us truly happy, what is the true good, if there's any question worth asking in life, this has got to be on that list of top 5. Sure. Because what else are we doing? We're operating thinking that getting into a good college will make us happy. We're operating thinking that making a lot of money will make us happy. But we've never stopped to even ask the question in the first place. And here, too, I get to introduce Plato, and they have this encounter with Plato. And I emphasize the idea that we don't philosophize alone. Philosophy is not someone going off by himself into the woods and just thinking deeply. It's this great conversation that we have, and we can invite the great minds of the past. So we philosophize in the presence of Plato and Aristotle and Thomas Aquinas and Plotinus and all these other great minds, and brilliant people, even if they were wrong about something, still to be able to look at the thoughts that they had and think about where they were right, where they were wrong. Descartes and Hume and Kant. And, the list goes on and on. Yeah. But to be able to have this great conversation. And then to see that, of course, that other people have joined in this conversation in their own way. Tolkien wasn't a philosopher, but he was a writer. And he created fiction. Apart, of course, from his job as a philologist. And so he made his own contribution. And it's just, we're all a part of it. And then the following week, so I have here 10, pick a quote or two. Like I said, on the wall of my classroom, the walls, there are over 150 quotes. And a lot of them, I think, unfortunately, never get read. Since it's kind of a big piece of text, the words are really small, and so the students rarely go over there to read them. But typically by this time of the year, I've finished putting up all the quotes, because it takes a while. Sure. I think I might be up to 170 or 180 at this point. Yeah, it's a lot. It's quite an endeavor. Yeah. Oh, see, here I have over 120 quotes, but maybe, I don't know, because I keep adding to it. I keep reading, and I keep finding great quotes, so I put them up. And then that's what the appendix is. And so for the reader, it will be like, well, explore the appendix. And in the appendix, they're categorized: math and physics, philosophy, about reading, mankind, philosophy and wisdom, teaching and learning, all these different ideas. But on the wall, they're just all over the place. And so I tell them, because I want them to read the quotes, and to start considering them, I tell them to take 5 minutes and just read as many quotes as they can, pick out 2 that they thought were interesting. And of course, this conversation is always very different. But there are a few quotes, interestingly, that are perennials, that they will come up again and again, either here or at some other point during the year. And so people will pick a quote. So one that comes up often is the first one here. The student says, I like the one about how people are schooled but not educated. And that's from St. Thomas More. He says, one of the great problems of our time is that many are schooled but few are educated. And that's a great opportunity then to talk about the difference between schooling and education. Yes. Like we were talking about, getting a high school diploma versus being educated. Right. And I talk about how I think, the word educate is related, maybe by chance, to the cave story. Although, I haven't done the cave story yet. So that's actually coming up.
Okay.
Soon. But we talk about Plato's cave. And I tell them that quote is actually from a long time ago. That's not a modern quote. That's from someone who was speaking, a few hundred years ago. And even at that time, that was a problem. Man by nature desires to know. Of course, the great quote from Aristotle. That one often comes up. One of the quotes that this year a student picked out is that aesthetic criteria are enormously valuable in forming our judgments. And that was from Roger Penrose. And Roger Penrose was a great theoretical physicist, still around. And but they're pointing out, too, beauty, that's just reinforcing what I had said to them at the beginning of the year. That, beauty is one of the things that's important when it comes to physics. So then asking them questions, things that come across as just sort of could be dinner conversation starters. If you've got 2 weeks left to live, how would you spend your time?
Right.
And this one, again, this is kind of like Introduction to Ethics. The way that we spend our time is the things that we think will make us happy. But also to put things in perspective, that the fact is that we are going to die at some point.
Yeah.
And this one is, sometimes it's inspiring to hear what students say. Sometimes it's disappointing and saddening. Like someone said, I would watch movies straight for 2 weeks. Actually this year I had one student say that he would just go, he and his family, they have a house in the mountains in Maine, and he would just go and be with his family for 2 weeks. And I was like, wow, that's actually really cool to hear a high school kid say that. But oftentimes, it's some interesting conversations. And I learn about the students as well. But then to ask the question, well, what is the good life? What is, what are we really doing here with our time? And then in 45, some of the quotes are so important, I think, that I just picked them out and I put them on the board. So I say, true or false. It's because I have a quote from someone that says, it's better to believe a painful truth than a comforting illusion. And then I want to know from the students, what do you think? Is that true or false? And oftentimes when they think about it, when they really think about it, they come to realize that it is better to believe a truth, even if it's painful.
Yes.
So then the conversation about truth. And I try to point out, too, that maybe there's no such thing as a painful truth when we think about it the right way, because the mind was made for truth. And so then to have truth is always a good thing for us in the end. Yeah. Emotionally, it might be painful, but when you have what something was made for, it can never be a bad thing overall. And then 13, again, the ethics comes up a lot because I try to get them to think about, what is it that makes something right or wrong? Something is good, something is bad, but why? Why does that make it what it is? And this is one that is really tough. The students constantly coming back to either two ideas: one, utilitarianism, and two, relativism. That really right and wrong is just a matter of opinion. And then when I really kind of spell it out for them in kind of graphic terms, that if you want to say that it's just a matter of what people like or don't like, then you'd have to say that something like murdering infants is not really wrong. It's just some people don't like it. And then people start to wake up and they're like, wait a minute, I don't think that's right. But then again, like we said before, they come back to it and they forget and they come back and then have to remind them of the conversation. But it's one that comes up often. The ethics conversations are good because it's stuff they can think about. It's practical. It's a little easier than introducing something like metaphysics, which can be very abstract. And then I have to. So we're into the year. I have a relationship with the students, and I try to pick a Friday where I have a little bit more time. I'm not rushed. I'm not under some kind of deadline. And we read the Allegory of the Cave from Plato. And another point here too is just to get them to interact with the text, so that they can realize that, you know what, I can read Plato, and maybe if I'm talking with some people, I can kind of understand and think about these ideas. And I use the Allegory of the Cave as an illustration of philosophy, that we come out of our kind of entrenched ideas, the ideas that we haven't thought about, and then we think about them. We realize that maybe things aren't what we know. And I pair this with a really fascinating text from I think it's Tolstoy's book, Anna Karenina. And I have to confess that I didn't finish reading the book, but I did come across this passage in the beginning. It talks about the main character in totally unphilosophical terms. He is like the anti-philosopher. And to point out, like, this is someone who's in the cave, absolutely 100%, just operating on, newspaper headlines. He's just there to fill his stomach, and he evaluates ideas about whether or not they serve him, and not even really consciously. And so, again, exposing them to these pieces of literature, and that's a big one that I make sure I get in during the year so that they can think clearly about philosophy and have an image of it. Some of them have read it already, but then trying to open it up for them in the context of philosophy, not just a literature class.
Sure.
And then 17 is one that I think is really important that I do with my students. And one of the reasons is just the impact that it has that I can see. I mean, I remember a student that I had the year before. I had him as a junior, and then I saw him again his senior year. And he asked, do you still do Philosophy Fridays? I was like, yeah. And then he brought up this one. He was like, oh, I'll never forget when you did the one with the mansion. I was like, oh, which is good. I mean, it's the thing that I'm going for. And of course, I use this. A lot of the stuff in this book, I use in my book, A Fool's Errand, which is the introduction to philosophy for young Catholics. And of course, I could write that book. I had been doing this for years, and so that book was pretty easy to write because there was already all this stuff that I was discussing with my students. But you can never, this one, I always feel bad that I can never quite capture it in writing the way that it happens in person. So I asked my students if they could have anything in a mansion. They win the lottery, money's not an issue for them. They could put whatever they want. What would they put in there? An aquarium, swimming pools, bowling alley, really super fancy furniture, whatever they want. And then I asked them, well, would you let the garbage men put garbage in your house? I'm like, no. Would you let the sewer people direct sewer lines into your house? Like, no, that's crazy. What are you doing? And then I tell them, you would be very careful about what you put into your mansion, but, and then I pause and I say this really slowly. And it's actually a line that I got from Angela's Ashes, a book written by Frank McCourt. years ago.
Right.
He said his teacher said this to him, and it really stuck with me, and I was able to turn it into this analogy and use it. But I tell him, I say, you would be really careful if you had a mansion about what went into your mansion. I tell him, your mind is a palace, and it's worth far more than any mansion you could have on this earth. I say, what do you put into your mansion? What ideas do you allow in there? And I ask him to think about the last 24 hours, all the things that they watched, that they listened to, that they read, social media. Some of the students are convinced that they don't read anything, and I'm like, no, you do. You read social media. Even if it's just a meme, you're still reading something. You're still taking it in.
Right.
These are, and some of the kids, I mean, I've had students on a regular basis, students will groan out loud. They're like, oh, as they're thinking about the media that they consume. I'm like, what are you letting into your mansion? What's going on in there? And that philosophy can help to be the guard at the door and to kind of sort through, so that there aren't any ideas left in there that are unexamined.
Right.
That they have taken the time to think carefully about what it is that they're letting into the palace of their mind. So, and then to talk about the meaning of life, I think I kind of have to. It's philosophy and introductory. Students would want to discuss it, but sometimes too, I just leave the questions up in the air. I don't try to answer them. A lot of with the ethics as well. I'd probably get fired if I did try to answer them for the students, but I give hints. And of course, I tell them, like, I've written books and I have YouTube channels. My answers to these questions are not secret.
Right.
But just to kind of scratch the surface a little bit, kind of open up the ideas so that they can think about them. Even something like the meaning of life, their rights. People talk about their rights all the time. I'll move to number 19 here. And so even like chapter 21, this one's always kind of fun. And when I introduce it, I try to be as provocative as I can to get them to think. Like, okay, you're always told why you shouldn't cheat, but today we're going to talk about why you should cheat. And they're like, what? What are you talking about? And so then I contrast the utilitarian approach versus the other approaches, deontology, the law kind of thing, and then happiness, natural law, kind of virtue ethics. Because even cheating, students do it, again, out of a utilitarian kind of idea. Chapter 22, this is what I do for every Valentine's Day. Of course, can money buy love? Because there are so many slogans associated with love, especially in the LGBTQ movement. Love is love, all this kind of thing. So I want them to really think about what is love? In a real kind of analytical, when people use these words, what is it that they're talking about? And so I introduce it with, can money buy love? And so I let them talk about it for a little while. And then I explain some of the different meanings of the word love. The 4 different Greek words, so that they can be exposed like, oh, yeah, we do have all these different meanings. And then that leads into my short kind of mini-series on logical fallacies. And the first one is equivocation, where you use the same word but with different meanings to kind of fool the person that you're having an argument with. So when people are using this word love, sometimes they're equivocating because the terms have not been clearly defined. Chronological snobbery, so that's like, people thinking that everyone was an idiot before last week because they thought the earth didn't go around the sun. This, people will talk about the Middle Ages with a sneer just because it was a long time ago. Like,
right.
The fallacy of ad hominem, people pointing at someone and just, well, that guy's pointing to the character, but pointing out that these are things that are not, they don't make any sense to argue that way. And so, it's this whole series, all these different questions that I bring up, things I'm trying to get them to think about, quotes that I present to them, even one of them, so the Newton's Flaming Laser Sword, I show them a YouTube video and then point out a kind of a big problem with something that someone had said in there. I introduce them to Socrates, and we talk about the apology and his idea of boxing with shadows there in his defense of himself. And then I get to the end, and so my final lecture is kind of a synthesis of thoughts on philosophy of beauty and science. And so I've got quotes from scientists talking about beauty and how important beauty is, and that being really a part of education, excuse me, and what we're made for, that we are made for beauty. And that beauty is something objective, to give them a definition of beauty so that they don't walk away thinking that beauty is just something that's purely subjective, a matter of opinion, as they would say. That beauty is worth pursuing, and it's not the same thing as taste. So, anyway, that's kind of the summary of the book.
That's a lot. Yeah.
It is a lot.
Well,
it takes all year.
It's a lot, yeah. And by doing it in small bites like this, I think they probably learn most of it.
Yeah, I hope so.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Yeah. I always ask my students, they'll ask me for recommendations because I'm their junior year science teacher, so I have to write college recommendations. And I ask them, because I want to kind of pull a little bit more out of them before I try to write a recommendation. And I ask them if they remember anything in particular in my class that left an impression. Because if I can take something and kind of create a story around that, it helps me to write the recommendation. And 9 times out of 10, students will talk about Philosophy Fridays.
Yeah, I bet that's true. Yeah, because it makes them think. I mean, physics in itself, yes, it's one thing. You need to learn it. I mean, I can understand that that's the way they were approaching it. We have to do this to graduate. But to have their minds opened up, that's wonderful.
Yeah.
So I can see where that would make a lasting impression on them.
Yeah. Yeah.
I bet a lot of them are going to try to follow in your footsteps.
I hope so.
Yeah,
I haven't
really.
Well, I have had some students graduate and then they get back in touch with me and we kind of keep in touch a little bit. And they say like, "Oh, I'm taking a philosophy class this year." I'm like, "Oh, cool, interesting." And sometimes I'm thinking to myself, "Oh no, like where are they taking these classes?" Because I think about my undergraduate degree at a secular school, and it was I wouldn't call it an education in wisdom. It was an education in primarily modern philosophy, which I would say there's a lot of foolishness. But
oh, sure, yeah. So they're getting a lot from you, and I mean it when I say that. I bet a lot of them are going to remember you, and a lot of them are going to try to follow in your footsteps and have the kind of impact that you had on them, on the people that will, that they'll be teaching or training or working with, or their children. So
I hope so.
Yeah.
Awesome.
Well, we won't know in this life, but you will know in the next.
No, that's right.
Yes.
Someday.
Yeah.
Someday.
Yeah.
So.
And
even if I never find out, even if it made a difference for one student, it's all worth it.
Oh, I'm sure you have already. Yes. Yeah. Many times over. So this is really a fascinating book, and I would urge our listeners. It's what happens when you're a teacher and you write. You think in terms of readers.
Yeah, that's right. You're thinking right. Yeah.
I would suggest that our listeners purchase a copy through En route. I assume it's available on Amazon also, true?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. So they can. The listeners can also look on Amazon, and this is really a book well worth purchasing. Philosophy Fridays.
Yeah.
So, Is there anything else you'd like to say before we close?
No, that's it.
Okay.
It was a ton of fun. It's a ton of fun to do it. It was a ton of fun to kind of put it together and write it. And
sure. Well, I think there's others on the way. Yeah. I think there'll be others on the way. So don't give up your writing.
Oh, no, I won't.
Good. Okay, would you like to close with a prayer?
I'd be happy to.
Mm-hmm.
In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Heavenly Father, we thank you for our lives, for our minds. We thank you that education happens in community in the way that you've made us, that all things work together in this beautiful way that you've designed. And we ask that you open up our eyes more and more to the beauty in all things, to see the radiance of what is true and good. Mm-hmm. And I pray for my students that you open their eyes to that beauty as well, and to anyone else who might read this book. Thank you, Father. Amen. In the Father,
Amen.
the Son, and the Holy Spirit.
Amen. Okay, well, thank you very much. And when you do write another book, please get in touch with me, and we'll have another interview.
I will. I look forward to it. Thank you.
Okay. Take care. Yep.
You
Bye-bye.
too. All right. Bye-bye.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.